The paper hit the table like a gunshot. Nelson Hale stared at it. 3 notices, lined up side by side on the scarred oak surface of his office desk, each one stamped in red ink that looked too much like blood. He had read them so many times in the past week that the words had stopped making sense, had collapsed into shapes without meaning, but the numbers remained perfectly clear. They always did. Numbers had a cruelty to them that words could never quite match. $1,460 to Amos Pratt, due by the 1st of October. $820 to the Cattlemen's Bank of Caldwell, Kansas, with interest compounding at 6% per annum, overdue since August. And the last one, the one that made his jaw tighten every single time, $600 to Virgil Horne, private creditor, payable upon demand, with a handwritten note at the bottom that read simply, "I will come to collect." That was not a note. That was a threat wearing a suit. Nelson pressed both palms flat against the desk and stood up slowly. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that had started to show the faintest trace of silver at his temples, and eyes the color of the Kansas sky in late September, that particular shade of blue-gray that could not quite decide whether it was hopeful or resigned. His ranch, the Double H, sat on 400 acres of prime grazing land outside Caldwell, and it had been his father's before it was his, and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Hale blood had soaked into that earth, and now it was about to be taken from him because one bad drought year had become 2, and one failed cattle drive had cascaded into a series of financial disasters that he had not seen coming and had not known how to stop. He walked to the window. Outside, the October sun was low and hard, the kind of light that stripped everything to its bare truth and left nowhere to hide. His foreman, a grizzled man named Pete Calloway, was crossing the yard toward the barn, and Nelson watched him without really seeing him. His mind was already in the place it kept returning to, that dark corridor of numbers and deadlines and a future that was narrowing like a river drying into sand. Virgil Horne would be here by Friday. He had 3 days. He turned away from the window, and that was when the door to his office opened and the woman walked in. She did not knock. That was the first thing he noticed. Not out of rudeness, he would come to understand, but because she had been knocking on doors her entire life and had grown tired of waiting for permission to simply exist somewhere. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her with a firmness that made the latch click shut like a period at the end of a sentence. She was carrying a carpetbag in one hand and a folded letter in the other, and she stood in his doorway the way a person stands when they have already survived the worst thing and have nothing left to be afraid of. Her name was Mamie Hadley, and she had just traveled 400 miles on the recommendation of a woman she barely knew. In response to a newspaper advertisement she had answered 6 weeks ago, for the position of ranch bookkeeper and household manager at the Double H, Caldwell, Kansas, published by one Nelson Hale, owner. She was 27 years old. Her hair was the deep, warm brown of pecan wood, pulled back with practical efficiency, but not without a certain unconscious elegance. Her eyes were the kind of green that made people look twice, not because they were simply pretty, but because they carried something in them, a quality of clear, unflinching attention that made most people feel simultaneously seen and slightly unsteady. She was wearing a dark blue traveling dress that had seen better days but wore its weariness with dignity, and there was a small scar along the left side of her jaw that she made no effort to conceal. She looked at the 3 notices on his desk. She looked at him. "You must be Mr. Hale," she said. Her voice was steady. "I'm Mamie Hadley. I've come about the position." Nelson stared at her. He had forgotten entirely that he had placed that advertisement. That had been in August, 6 weeks ago, when he had still believed he might be able to save the ranch through competent management alone, before the second letter from Amos Pratt arrived, before Virgil Horne had sent his handwritten threat. He had forgotten it the way a drowning man forgets the boat he launched from. "Miss Hadley," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped by 2 weeks of not enough sleep and too much whiskey. I'm afraid the timing is not ideal." She glanced again at the 3 red stamp notices on his desk. She did not pretend she had not seen them. "No," she said quietly. "It looks like it's precisely ideal." He blinked. She set her carpetbag down, walked to his desk without waiting for an invitation, and picked up the nearest notice, the one from Amos Pratt. She read it with the focused calm of a woman who has dealt with financial documents before and is not impressed by threatening ink. $1,460, she said. "When is this due?" Nelson found himself answering before he had made a decision to. "October 1st. That's 9 days from now." She set it down and picked up the bank notice. $820 with interest. When did this first fall due? August 15th. So it's been compounding for 6 weeks. She did the arithmetic in her head without pausing. That's roughly $875 now, depending on the exact rate. She looked at him. "What are your current liquid assets?" He stared at her. "I don't know that's Mr. Hale." Her voice did not rise, but it changed, the way a river changes when it narrows, carrying the same volume of water with considerably more force. "I am standing in your office looking at 3 creditor notices that together represent nearly $3,000 in debt with overlapping deadlines. You placed an advertisement for a bookkeeper. I have come to answer it. Either you want my help or you do not. But if you do, then the first thing we are going to need to do is look at the truth of this situation without flinching. So I ask again, what are your current liquid assets?" Nelson Hale had been managing his own affairs for 7 years. He had negotiated with cattle buyers and railroad men and county officials. He had held his own in rooms full of men who thought a young rancher was easy prey. And he had never, not once in those 7 years, felt quite so thoroughly handled by another person as he did in this moment. He sat down. He told her the truth. His liquid assets were $112 in the office safe, a small herd of 38 cattle that were not yet at market weight, and a promissory note from a buyer in Wichita who had been delaying payment for 3 months. She listened to all of it. She did not react the way he expected, with alarm or the particular kind of slow, sorrowful head-shaking that people performed when they were actually pleased to witness someone else's misfortune. She just listened, and when he was finished, she pulled out the chair across from his desk and sat down and said, "Tell me about Virgil Horne." The name made something tighten in Nelson's chest. "What makes you ask about him specifically?" "Because the other 2 notices are formal documents. His has a personal note attached. That means the relationship is different. Either he's a friend whose trust you've broken, or he's a predator who's been waiting for you to get to exactly this point." The silence in the room stretched out long and thin. "The second one," Nelson said at last. Mamie nodded, unsurprised. "Then he's the dangerous one. Tell me everything." This was how Nelson Hale began to talk to Mamie Hadley. Not the way a man talks to a woman he is courting, with careful performances of strength and confidence. Not the way a proud man talks to anyone about his failures, with deflections and half-truths and careful omissions. He talked to her the way a man talks when he has been carrying something alone for so long that the moment another person offers to help hold the weight, his hands simply open. He told her about Virgil Horne. Virgil Horne was 53 years old, and he had arrived in Caldwell from St. Louis 2 years prior, and no one knew exactly what he had done in St. Louis, but the stories that preceded him suggested it was nothing that would look well in daylight. He had set himself up as a private money lender, which was not unusual in a frontier town where the formal banking infrastructure was still thin and unreliable. He offered loans with terms that looked almost reasonable on paper if you read them quickly, and did not look too closely at the clause on page 3 that gave him the right to demand full repayment at any time with 3 days' notice. Nelson had taken a $600 loan from Horne 18 months ago, during the first drought year, because the bank had been slow and the cattle drive was coming, and he had needed to pay his workers and buy feed, and the only option that had appeared was Horne's money, And Horne's money had come with that smile, that particular smile of a man who is entirely confident that you are already his. He had been making payments. He had been on time. And then the second drought year had hit, and the drive had failed, and Pratt had called in his debt, and the bank had started its letters, and Horne had sent the note. "I will come to collect." "He doesn't actually need the money," Nelson said. "He wants the land." Mamie was quiet for a moment. "How do you know that?" "Because he told me, last month when I went to speak with him about an extension. He looked at me across his desk and he said, 'Mr. Hale, I have all the money I need. What I find interesting is that you have something I want.'" The room felt colder for a moment, as if the memory had brought the temperature down. Mamie looked at the window, then back at Nelson. "What is the Wichita buyer's name?" "The one with the promissory note. Tate Drummond. He owes me $240 for a partial delivery I made in July. Have you pursued collection through the county court?" "I've written twice." "Have you filed a formal claim?" He paused. "No." "Then we file one tomorrow." She stood up, smoothing her skirt with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had already moved past the part of the conversation where they were talking about what the problem was and was now in the part where they were talking about what to do. "Do you have a copy of the promissory note?" "In the safe." "Good. I'll need to see all of your financial records, every ledger, every receipt, every contract. Tonight, if possible." Nelson stood up too. He was a full head taller than her, and the office suddenly felt smaller than it had 30 minutes ago, which was strange because the addition of another person should have made it feel larger, not more contained. "Miss Hadley," he said, "I haven't actually hired you yet." She looked up at him. "No," she agreed, "you haven't." The silence that followed was the particular kind that carries a question inside it. "What are your terms?" he asked. $15 a month, room and board included, and a percentage of any debts I help you recover or renegotiate. I will keep your books, manage your household accounts, and help you navigate what is coming from Horne. I will not steal from you, I will not lie to you, and I will not leave in the middle of a crisis." She paused, and something shifted very slightly in her expression, a flicker of something that was not quite vulnerability but was in the same neighborhood. "I have my own reasons for needing steady work and a stable place, Mr. Hale. This is not charity in either direction." He looked at her for a long moment. The October light was falling across her face through the window, catching the green in her eyes, and she held his gaze without blinking, without performing anything at all, just looking at him with that absolute, unflinching attention that he was already beginning to understand was simply who she was. "Done," he said. She nodded once briskly. "Then show me to my room and then show me the ledgers." He did both. The room she was given was the small one off the back hallway, previously used for storage, and Nelson had Pete Calloway help clear the boxes out while Mamie organized them in the adjacent room, because she was already categorizing them, and she had already found 2 boxes of receipts that had never been properly filed, and she was making notes in her small leather-bound notebook with the focused intensity of a person who was in their natural element. Pete Calloway watched her with barely concealed astonishment. He was 58 years old and had been with the Hale family for 22 years, and he had a weather-beaten face and a deeply skeptical relationship with change of any kind. "She's not what I expected," he said to Nelson in a low voice as they carried the last box out. "What did you expect?" Nelson asked. Pete scratched the back of his neck. "Someone quieter." Nelson said nothing because he was already thinking about the ledgers and about what Mamie was going to find in them and about the particular quality of dread that comes when you know that someone competent is about to look at everything you have been managing alone and tell you exactly how bad it is. It was worse than he had feared and slightly better than he had begun to believe in his darkest nights. That was Mamie's assessment, delivered 3 hours later at 9 o'clock in the evening with the ledgers spread across the kitchen table and 2 oil lamps burning and the rest of the ranch hands long since asleep. "You're not insolvent," she said without preamble, setting down her pencil. "You're illiquid. Those are different things." "Explain the difference to Amos Pratt," Nelson said, with more bitterness than he intended. She looked at him steadily. The difference is this. If you were insolvent, the land and assets wouldn't cover the debts even at full value, but they do. If you sold the Double H today at fair market value, you would clear all 3 debts and have roughly $400 left over. The problem is not your worth. The problem is timing and Horne's specific clause. So the land could save me if I sell it. Yes, and Horne knows that. He wants you to feel you have no choice but to sell, and he wants to be the buyer at his price, not the market price. That's the trap. She tapped the notice with one finger. He will come Friday, and he will offer to forgive the loan in exchange for a deed transfer. He'll make it sound like he's rescuing you. Nelson felt something cold move through him because she had described the future with an accuracy that felt like prophecy. How do you know that? Because I've seen it before. Her voice remained steady, but there was something in it now, that thing that was not quite vulnerability. Not here, in Missouri. Different man, same architecture. He waited until the debt was at its most painful, and then he arrived with a smile and an offer that sounded like salvation and was actually the end of everything. She paused. I grew up on a farm that was taken this way, Mr. Hale. My father's farm. I was 19. I watched him sign the papers because he didn't see what was happening until it was done. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere distant, that lonesome descending note that is the sound of the Kansas night making itself known. I'm sorry, Nelson said, and he meant it in the simple, direct way that comes before language has a chance to dress itself up. She looked at him for a moment and then she picked up her pencil again. That's why I learned to read contracts, she said, and ledgers, and the small print on page 3. They worked until past 11. Mamie drew up a plan on 3 sheets of paper. The Wichita promissory note claim needed to be filed immediately with the Sumner County Court, which could yield $240 within 3 to 4 weeks if pursued aggressively. The cattle, 38 head, were not at full market weight, but were close enough that a local buyer might take them at a slight discount rather than waiting for the spring drive, which could bring in perhaps $650 to $700 depending on negotiation. That was nearly $1,000, leaving a deficit of roughly $2,900, which means, she said, that you cannot pay all 3 by October 1st through assets alone. But you can pay Pratt, which removes the most immediate legal pressure. The bank will grant an extension if you demonstrate active repayment and show them the cattle sale and the Wichita claim. Banks prefer extensions to foreclosures because foreclosures are expensive and time-consuming. I can write the letter to the bank tomorrow. And Horne? Nelson asked. She looked at the 3rd notice. Horne is the one we have to be most careful with. His clause gives him the right to demand payment in 3 days, but that clause has to be executed lawfully. If you have a lawyer, I need to speak with them. I have a lawyer, Henry Carver, in town. Can you arrange a meeting tomorrow? Yes. Good. She stacked the papers neatly and capped her ink bottle. There may be a hidden defect in Horne's contract, Mr. Hale. Loan contracts with demand clauses in Kansas have to meet certain conditions under state law to be enforceable. If that clause was improperly structured, his leverage disappears. Not entirely, but significantly. Nelson was watching her. The lamplight was warm on her face, and she was entirely focused on the papers in her hands. But there was something about her posture, something about the way she sat at his kitchen table, as if she had a perfect right to be there, and was not performing any of the small diminishments that women in 1883 were constantly pressured to perform, that made him feel something he had not felt in a very long time. Not attraction, not yet, not exactly, though there was already an awareness there that he was not examining closely. It was something closer to recognition, like seeing a kind of courage in a form he hadn't expected and being moved by it. Why did you really come here? He asked before he could think better of it. She looked up. I told you, the advertisement. You answered an advertisement placed by a rancher in financial trouble in a town you'd never been to, based on what? A reference from someone you barely knew, you said. She held his gaze. Mrs. Alois Rutter in Newton. She and I taught at the same school for 2 years. She knew your aunt, apparently. My Aunt Margaret. Yes. Mrs. Rutter wrote me that this was a reputable family, that the land was real, and that the position was legitimate. She paused, and I needed to be somewhere that was not where I was. He waited. She glanced down at the papers, then back at him, and made a small, deliberate decision. I was engaged, she said, until 4 months ago, to a man in Newton who turned out to have a wife and 2 children in Lawrence. I discovered this from the wife herself, who came to my door in July. A small, dry, entirely unsentimental pause. So, I needed somewhere new. The silence held between them, not uncomfortable, not charged with anything that required addressing, just the honest quiet of 2 people who have exchanged real information and are letting it settle. Kansas is full of men making themselves up from scratch, Nelson said. It's not only men who do it, Mamie said. He nodded slowly. No, I suppose not. She stood up, gathering the papers and tucking them under her arm. Get some sleep, Mr. Hale. Tomorrow is going to be a long day and we are going to need you sharp. She went to her room. He sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, listening to the coyote and the wind and the creak of the house settling around him. And he thought that the evening had not gone anything like the way he had expected when she had walked through his door, and that this was, in an entirely unexpected way, the first time in weeks that he had felt something other than the particular weight of a man waiting for the worst to arrive. He felt marginally like someone who was fighting instead of drowning. It was not a large feeling, but it was enough to get him upstairs and into bed, and it was enough to let him sleep. Morning came in hard and bright the way October mornings do on the Kansas plains, with a clarity that borders on severity. Mamie was already at the kitchen table when Nelson came downstairs, and she had coffee on the stove and the financial papers spread out again, and a fresh sheet covered in her tight, precise handwriting. She had clearly been up for some time. Pete Calloway appeared in the doorway, took in the scene, and retreated without a word, which Nelson noted as the most diplomatic thing he had ever seen Pete do. I've drafted the letter to the Cattlemen's Bank, Mamie said, without looking up. And I've written down what you need to say to Henry Carver this morning about the Horne contract. Do you have the original document? In the safe. Nelson poured himself a coffee and sat across from her, and she handed him the bank letter, and he read it, and it was the best letter he had read in his life. It was honest without being weak, detailed without being desperate, and it made a compelling case for a 90-day extension based on the pending cattle sale and the Wichita claim. It was the letter of a person who understood both finance and human nature, which were not, Mamie believed, as different as people liked to think. This is excellent, he said. I know, she said simply, without false modesty. Now get the Horne contract. He got it. She read it at the table while he finished his coffee, and she read it twice, slowly, with the particular quality of concentration that made the air around her feel denser somehow, as if she were pulling all available attention toward the page. And then she sat back and looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was not quite triumph but was in the same territory. The demand clause, she said, requires 30 days written notice delivered by registered post, not 3 days. Someone wrote 3 days in the attached note, and Horne is counting on you not reading the actual contract carefully. The clause on page 3 reads 30 days notice. She turned the document toward him and pointed. Right there. Nelson leaned forward and read it. 30 days. He read it again. 30 days. He's been lying, Nelson said. He's been relying on you to be frightened enough not to look, Mamie said. Which is not the same thing legally, but it amounts to the same theft. Nelson sat back. He felt the thing that happens when a trap you have been standing in is revealed, when the jaws you have been staring at turn out to be painted iron. Relief and fury arrive together, the way they usually do. He hasn't even sent formal written notice, Mamie continued. He sent a personal note, which means the clock hasn't even started yet. You have at minimum 30 days from the date he sends a proper registered notice. Which means, Nelson said, working through it, That if we can sell the cattle and collect the Wichita debt within 30 days, you could pay Horne in full and he gets nothing but his money, which is the last thing he wants. She said it without celebration, just steady factual delivery. But he will not wait passively once he realizes you know this. He will find another lever. He is that kind of man. She looked at Nelson directly. Are there any other debts? Any other financial instruments he might have a claim on, or anyone else who might be working with him? The question was quiet, but it landed with weight, because it carried inside it the word that had not yet been spoken but had been present in the room since yesterday. Betrayal. Nelson thought about it carefully. There's a man named Roy Deckert who works for Horne as a sort of agent. He approached me last spring about buying the north pasture separately from the rest of the property. I declined. He paused. He's also on the county land assessment board. Mamie's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. That's important. He could undervalue the property to make a forced sale harder to challenge. I'd like to look at the most recent county assessment of the Double H. I have a copy. Of course you do. She almost smiled at that. Just almost. Just the barest softening at one corner of her mouth. And Nelson found himself watching for it the way you watch for a specific star to appear in a darkening sky. They rode into Caldwell together at 8 o'clock. Nelson drove the buckboard and Mamie sat beside him with her notebook and the folder of documents, and the morning was cold enough to see their breath, and the road into town was rutted from the last rain, and it occurred to Nelson, as they rode in silence that was not uncomfortable but was simply quiet, that he had not had anyone sitting beside him in that particular way, as a partner in something rather than a visitor, for a very long time. His wife had died 3 years ago, Clara. She had died of a fever in January of 1880, 6 months after their wedding, and he had buried her on a hillside of the Double H where the wildflowers came in spring, and he had never spoken of her to anyone, not really, in the years since. He had packed that grief into a place inside himself and built walls around it and moved forward, because there was always work to do and the ranch required him, and the forward motion of labor was the only thing that had kept him from being consumed by it. He was not thinking about Clara now in any way that was painful. He was simply aware, in the October morning light, that the silence beside him had a different quality than the silence of the years since, and that he was not sure what to do with that yet, but that it was there. Henry Carver's office was on Main Street, above the dry goods store. He was 51 years old, with a careful, precise mind and reading spectacles that he wore halfway down his nose and peered over in a way that managed to be both professorial and slightly judgmental. He had been the Hale family's lawyer for 14 years, and he received Nelson with the warm gravity of a man who is deeply fond of his client and deeply concerned about his current situation. He received Mamie with more uncertainty. "Miss Hadley is my bookkeeper and financial manager," Nelson said, as they settled into the 2 chairs across from Henry's desk. "She will be present for all discussions regarding the Double H's financial affairs." Henry looked at Mamie over his spectacles. Mamie looked back at Henry with the calm, attentive expression of someone who has been underestimated many times before and has learned to find it instructive rather than offensive. "Of course," Henry said, and there was in his voice the particular combination of doubt and courtesy that is the sound of a person deciding to hold their skepticism in reserve. Within 15 minutes, the skepticism was gone entirely. Mamie laid out the Horne contract analysis, the bank letter, the Wichita claim strategy, and the concerns about Roy Deckert and the land assessment. And she presented all of it with such precision and with such evident command of the relevant legal and financial considerations that Henry Carver removed his spectacles entirely, set them down on the desk, and looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has just shown him something he should have seen himself. "The demand clause," he said slowly, looking at the page she had marked. "I drafted this response letter for Nelson 3 weeks ago and I did not catch that." I read right past it. He looked at Nelson. "I owe you an apology." "Don't apologize to me," Nelson said with a slight dry edge. "I'm the one who signed it." Henry looked at Mamie again. "Miss Hadley, where did you receive your legal and financial education?" "I read everything I could find," she said. "And I spent 2 years as a secretary at a land title company in Missouri and 1 year teaching school, and I have been managing my own affairs since I was 21. I have found that necessity is an efficient teacher." Henry nodded slowly. "It is indeed." He picked up his spectacles. "All right, here is what we are going to do." He confirmed Mamie's reading of the contract. He agreed that the bank letter should be sent immediately. He said he could file the Wichita claim that afternoon. He raised the Deckert issue as a serious concern and suggested that they request a formal independent property assessment in anticipation of any legal challenge, which Mamie had already drafted as a suggestion in her notes, which she showed Henry, and Henry nodded again. And this time there was no doubt in his face at all, only something that looked very much like respect. As they were leaving, Henry Carver touched Nelson's sleeve briefly. "Where did you find her?" he said quietly. "She found me," Nelson said. Henry looked at him over his spectacles for just a moment. "Good timing," he said, and there was something in it that was not just about the financial crisis. Nelson chose not to examine that too closely. The cattle buyer was a man named Ira Schwartz, who operated out of a livestock yard on the south edge of Caldwell, and who had the wide, patient face of a man who has spent 30 years in negotiation and has learned that the best position is almost always a gentle one. He received them in his office, which smelled of straw and pipe tobacco, and he listened to Nelson's presentation of the 38 head with the focused courtesy of a man who is interested but not about to show it. Mamie sat beside Nelson and said nothing for the first 10 minutes, and then, when Schwartz offered $620 for the herd, she set her notebook down on her knee and said, "Mr. Schwartz, the weight assessment on these cattle was done by Pete Calloway last Thursday, and they are within 6 weeks of prime weight. You would put them to grass for 2 months and turn them at market weight for a return of approximately $900. We are offering you a $30 advantage on a $900 return. I think you can do better than $620. Ira Schwartz looked at her. Then he looked at Nelson. Nelson kept his face entirely neutral. $680, Schwartz said. $710, Mamie said, which is still an advantage of nearly $200 on the market price for prime weight. Schwartz was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, the slow, genuine smile of a man who has been outmaneuvered and has enough experience to appreciate it. $700, he said. That's my last number. Mamie glanced at Nelson. Nelson gave an almost imperceptible nod. Done, she said. $700. Payable on delivery, which they arranged for the following morning. Nelson would clear the Pratt debt completely, with $65 remaining, which combined with the $112 in the safe, gave him $177 of breathing room while they pursued the bank extension and the Wichita claim. They walked out of Schwartz's yard into the mid-morning sun, and Nelson stopped on the boardwalk and looked at her and said, $30. I'm sorry. You said I offered him a $30 advantage. $620 to $650 would be $30. But you went to $700. She looked at him with those clear green eyes. I said his advantage was $680 to $900. I didn't say 30 in reference to our minimum. He stared at her. I told him a true thing in a way that emphasized what I needed him to think about, she said calmly. That is not dishonesty. It is emphasis. Nelson looked at her for a long moment and then he laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in weeks, and it came out differently than laughter usually does, with a kind of rawness to it, as if it had traveled a long way to get there and was a little rough from the journey. Mamie watched him with that almost smile, the one at the corner of her mouth, and for a moment the October street with its foot traffic and its horses and its smell of wood smoke and dry earth was just the background, and the moment was just the two of them on the boardwalk and the unexpected warmth of his laughter and her watching it. Then a man walked past them and tipped his hat and said, "Morning, Hale," and the moment reformed itself back into the practical world. "We should get lunch," Nelson said, "and then we need to go back and prepare for Horne's arrival Friday." "Yes," Mamie agreed, "and I need to write a letter." "To whom?" "To Virgil Horne." He went still. "Mamie." It was the first time he had used her first name. Neither of them noted it aloud, but both of them noticed. "What are you going to say to him?" he asked. "I am going to tell him that you are aware of the terms of the original contract, that you have retained legal counsel, and that you look forward to receiving his formal 30-day notice through the required registered post channel, and that upon receiving said notice, you will of course be in a position to respond accordingly." She paused. In polite and businesslike language, Nelson was quiet for a moment. "You're going to tell him that we know." "I'm going to tell him that in a way that sounds like a cordial procedural reminder rather than a declaration of war," she said, "which is better strategy. He will understand exactly what I am saying, but he will not have anything to show anyone that looks like escalation on our part." "And you think that will stop him Friday?" "I think it will slow him Friday, and slowing is enough if we use the time well." She looked at him steadily. "He is going to be angry, Mr. Hale. Men like him always are, when the trap they've set turns out not to have closed. The important thing is to be legally and documentarily correct at every step, so that whatever he does next, we are on the right side of the record." They ate lunch at the hotel dining room, the only establishment in Caldwell that had tablecloths, which were white and slightly yellowed but were present nonetheless, and they talked about the plan and about the ranch and then, gradually, about other things. Nelson told her about the Double H's history. His grandfather Ephraim Hale had come out from Ohio in 1858 and staked the original claim and built the first structure, a single room that was now his office, with his own hands over the course of one brutal winter. His father Thomas had expanded it, added the main house, the barn, the bunkhouse, driven the first cattle herd in 1869. Nelson himself had taken over at 24 when Thomas died of a heart attack during a spring storm, and he had run it alone except for Pete Calloway and a rotating crew of hands. Mamie listened with the quality of attention that was becoming familiar to him, the kind that made you feel that what you were saying mattered not because it was being evaluated but because it was being genuinely received. "It's not just land," she said when he had finished. "No," he said, "it's not." "I know," she said, and then, after a moment, "That's why I'm going to help you keep it." The way she said it was not a promise made lightly. It was the kind of declaration that comes from a place deep enough that it does not need dramatic delivery, and it sat between them at the tablecloth table like something solid. Nelson looked at her. The dining room noise was around them, the clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversation and the smell of beef stew and fresh bread, and he looked at Mamie Hadley across the table and felt, with a clarity that surprised him by its simplicity, that she was the most remarkable person he had met in a very long time. He did not say this. It was not the moment for it. There were 3 creditors and a predator named Horne and a plan that required careful execution, and sentiment was a luxury for after. But the feeling was there, quietly, like a fire that has just caught and is not yet ready to declare itself. They rode back to the Double H in the afternoon, and Mamie wrote the letter to Horne while Nelson arranged the cattle delivery logistics with Pete Calloway, who listened to the whole plan with the considered silence of a man reassembling his understanding of a situation. "She figured all this out in one day," Pete said, when Nelson had finished. "She came in knowing more than we did," Nelson said. Pete scratched his neck again, which was his primary form of expression. "Your father would have liked her," he said, and then walked off to the barn before Nelson could respond. Thursday passed in a controlled storm of activity. The cattle were delivered to Schwartz in the morning, and the $700 arrived in a clean stack of bills that Nelson handled with a kind of reverence, because money that is going to save something feels different from money that is merely transactional. He sent Pete to Pratt's office immediately with $1,460, exact, in full. Amos Pratt was a heavy-set man with small eyes and a fondness for punctual payment that bordered on religious. And when Pete arrived with the full amount, he was so surprised that he recounted it 3 times. He issued a signed receipt and a release of the debt instrument, which Pete brought back to the ranch. Where Mamie filed it in the folder, she had labeled CLEARED with a satisfaction that, while never outwardly displayed, was clearly there in the precision with which she placed the document. Henry Carver filed the Wichita claim. He also requested the independent property assessment and prepared a formal response letter to be delivered to Horne's office, signed by Nelson, that politely and precisely cited the contract terms and expressed readiness to comply with them on the correct timeline. Mamie sent her letter to Horne by private courier Thursday evening. They had debated whether to send both Henry's letter and her own, and decided that Henry's was the legal document and hers served a different purpose, the purpose of letting Horne know, personally, that there was now someone at the Double H who had read page 3. Friday arrived with a cold front. The sky over Caldwell was the color of old pewter and the wind had teeth, and Nelson was in the yard at 9 o'clock when the black buggy appeared at the end of the long approach road to the Double H, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who believes he is going to win. Virgil Horne stepped out of the buggy and stood for a moment looking at the ranch house with the expression of a man who is imagining it already belonging to him. He was wearing a dark wool coat and a hat that cost more than most men's monthly wages, and he carried a leather satchel, and his smile, when he saw Nelson walking toward him, was the particular smile of preordained triumph. Nelson had spent 2 evenings with Mamie going over exactly how this conversation should go. He had it in him now, the legal understanding, the awareness of the contract terms, the knowledge of where his footing was solid. But more than that, he had something he had not had when Horne had met him across that desk last month. He had someone on his side who was smarter than Horne. "Hale," Horne said, extending his hand. "I've come to discuss our arrangement." "Good morning, Mr. Horne," Nelson said, shaking the hand. "Why don't we go inside? My financial manager is here." Something moved across Horne's face then, too quickly to fully catch, but it was there, not quite surprise. More like a recalibration. Mamie was at the kitchen table when they entered, and the files were open in front of her, and she had Henry Carver's response letter at the top and the original contract beside it. And she looked up at Horne with the calm, precise attention that was simply who she was and that managed to be, Nelson had come to understand, among the most unsettling things a person could direct at someone who was used to having all the information. Horne looked at her. He looked at the documents, he looked at Nelson. "I wasn't aware you employed a bookkeeper," he said. "Miss Hadley joined us this week," Nelson said. "She has been reviewing all financial instruments relating to the Double H." Horne sat down with the controlled ease of a man who is recalculating but does not want to show it. He put the leather satchel on the table. "I've come to discuss your loan. Given the difficulty of your current situation, I am prepared to offer you a generous—" "Mr. Horne," Mamie said, her voice entirely pleasant, "we've received your personal note, and we appreciate your attention to this matter. We've also reviewed the original loan contract, specifically the demand clause on page 3. She turned the contract toward him and pointed to the relevant paragraph, and her finger rested there with the patience of someone who is not in a hurry. "As you can see, the clause requires 30 days written notice delivered by registered post. We haven't yet received that notice. Once we do, we will of course respond within the required time frame." Horne looked at the page. Nelson watched him look at it, watched the calculations moving behind those small, sharp eyes. "I think you may have misread," Horne began. "Mr. Carver at Hale and Associates reviewed it yesterday," Mamie said. "He is available if you'd like to discuss the language with him directly. We have his written opinion here if you'd like to see it." She produced Henry's letter smoothly, the way a card player produces an ace without drama. "He confirms our reading of the clause." A silence. Horne looked at the papers. He looked at Mamie. He looked at Nelson. And then he picked up his satchel very slowly, and he put it back under his arm, and he stood up, and the smile was still on his face, but it had changed, had become a different kind of smile, the kind that belongs to a man who is postponing something rather than abandoning it. "It seems there may be some procedural details to attend to," he said. "I'll be in touch through proper channels." "We look forward to it," Nelson said. Horne left. They heard his buggy start down the road. Nelson stood at the window and watched it until it reached the bend and disappeared into the gray October morning, and then he turned around. Mamie was closing the folders with her usual methodical care. She was not performing triumph. She was not even visibly relieved. She was just doing the next thing, and the next thing was organizing the documentation of what had just happened. "He's going to come back harder," Nelson said. "Yes," she agreed. "But now we have 30 days and he knows we know the terrain." She looked up. "We're not safe yet, but we're not where we were Monday." Monday. She had been here 4 days. "Mamie," he said. She looked at him, waiting. "Thank you." She held his gaze for a moment, and there it was again, that almost smile, slightly more present this time, slightly less almost. "You're welcome, Mr. Hale." He noticed he had not corrected him to Nelson. He noticed she had not asked him to. The next 2 weeks moved with a particular quality of sustained effort that Nelson would later think of as one of the most unusual and strangely vivid periods of his life. Every morning began with coffee and the financial review, and every day had its tasks, its letters, its negotiations, its small victories and complications. The bank responded to Mamie's letter with a tentative offer of a 60-day extension, which Henry Carver negotiated to 90, based on the demonstrated cattle sale and the pending Wichita claim. The extension was not a resolution, but it was room to breathe. The Wichita claim progressed through the county court with the irritating slowness of legal processes in 1883, which were slower than the problem they were trying to solve and faster than doing nothing. Tate Drummond in Wichita, confronted with a formal legal claim, hired his own lawyer and disputed the delivery figures, which was not unexpected. Mamie had anticipated this and had kept a copy of every delivery receipt, signed by Drummond's own foreman, which she turned over to Henry Carver with a note that said, in her characteristic understated way, that she believed the case was straightforward. Horne sent his formal registered notice on October 18th. The 30-day clock began. By the time it arrived, Nelson had $177 in the safe, the bank extension secured, and the Wichita claim in court. Not enough to pay Horne in 30 days, not quite. They were still short. Mamie did not panic. He was learning in those weeks that she did not panic. She recalculated. She worked the problem. She sat across from him at the kitchen table in the evenings after dinner, with the lamplight warm and steady between them, and she turned the problem over from every angle the way a geologist examines a rock, with methodical patience and the expectation that there is always more to find. It was in one of those evenings that she said, quietly, "You have water rights." Nelson looked up from the ledger he was reviewing. "What?" "Your original land grant. I've been reading through it." She had been reading through it for 3 evenings. He realized, in addition to everything else. The Double H holds water rights to the creek that runs through the North Pasture, and those rights extend to the Kimball property on the eastern border. Does Martin Kimball know his water access depends on those rights? Nelson thought about it. "I don't think it's ever come up." "It might be worth a conversation," she said. "Not as leverage. As a business proposition. If Kimball's cattle depend on that creek access, he has an interest in the Double H remaining solvent and under current ownership. A short-term lease of the water rights formalized might represent." She made a quick calculation, perhaps $300 to $400, depending on his current herd size. Martin Kimball was 60 years old and had the weathered pragmatism of a man who had been on the frontier long enough to understand that alliances were not weakness. They were arithmetic. He rode over the following morning in response to Nelson's message, and he and Nelson sat on the porch and Mamie sat in the third chair, and the conversation was frank and practical, and ended with Kimball agreeing to a $300 payment for a formalized one-year water rights lease, which he said he should have done years ago but had never thought to, and which he seemed genuinely relieved to have clarified. $300. Not enough alone, but enough combined with what they had to get very close. The Wichita claim resolved on November 12th, 3 days before Horne's deadline. Drummond's dispute collapsed when Henry Carver presented the signed delivery receipts, and the court ordered payment of the full $240 plus $20 in court costs. The money was wired from Wichita and arrived at the Caldwell Bank on November 13th. Nelson Hale's total available funds on November 13th, $177 plus $300 plus $260, $737. He owed Horne $600. He had $137 left over. On November 15th at 10 o'clock in the morning, Henry Carver walked into Virgil Horne's office on Commercial Street with $600 in a bank draft payable to Horne and the fully executed release of the debt instrument for Horne's signature. Horne signed it. He did not smile the confident smile this time. He signed it with the contained fury of a man who has lost a game he had arranged to win, and he said nothing except, "Good day, Mr. Carver," with the cold precision of a man filing something away rather than letting it go. Henry Carver brought the signed release to the Double H that afternoon. He handed it to Nelson, who read it and handed it to Mamie, who read it and placed it in the folder labeled CLEARED, now thick with documents, and then she sat back in her chair and looked at Nelson, and he looked at her, and the relief between them was enormous and quiet and very real. "It's done," he said. "The immediate crisis is done," she said, with the careful accuracy she applied to everything. "You still need to rebuild the reserves, and you should revisit the bank loan terms in the spring." "But the ranch is yours," Nelson nodded. He looked at the folder on the table. 3 months ago, those 3 red-stamped notices had been laid out on his desk, and he had been standing at the window wondering how a man loses everything his family built across 3 generations. And now they were cleared, every one. He looked at Mamie. She was looking down at her notebook, making a final note, and her face was in 3/4 profile in the afternoon light, and there was a quality to her in that moment. Something about the combination of the relief and the accomplishment and the way she simply kept doing the next thing that made something shift quietly and irreversibly inside his chest. He had known it was coming, in the way you know a season is changing before the actual day it turns, a gradual accumulation of warmth and light that the calendar has not yet named but the body already feels. He had known it was there. He had not been ready to name it until now. He was in love with her. He did not say it. It was too large to say without preparation, without the proper space around it, and she had given so much to him in the past 7 weeks, had walked through his door and remade his entire situation through sheer competence and courage and something that was not charity and was not purely professional either, something that he recognized now as care, and he was not going to mishandle this. He was going to be careful with it the way you are careful with the things that matter most. But the feeling was there, clear and real, and he knew it. November in Kansas was cold in the way that reminds you the frontier is indifferent, that beauty and hardship are not opposites but companions, and the Double H in November was a particular kind of beautiful. Frost on the grass in the mornings, the sky that pure winter blue that had no gray in it at all, the smoke from the chimney rising straight up in the still air. Mamie had settled into the ranch with the unobtrusive efficiency of water finding its level. She had reorganized the filing system and the household accounts, and had introduced a weekly ledger review that Pete Calloway participated in with a reluctant but growing respect that he expressed by bringing her coffee in the mornings without being asked, and by occasionally deferring to her on questions about expenses before bringing them to Nelson. She had also, gradually and without fanfare, made the house a home again in small ways that Nelson noticed without commenting on. dried wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen windowsill, a tablecloth that had been in the chest since Clara. The lamp in the sitting room moved to the table where it gave better reading light. She was reading in that sitting room on a November evening, 3 days after Horne had been paid, when Nelson came in from the barn and sat down in the chair across from her and said, without the careful preparation he had planned, because the moment was simply there and he was in it, "I need to tell you something." Mamie looked up from her book. She held his gaze and she was waiting. "7 weeks ago you walked into my office and I had 3 creditors and I thought I was going to lose everything my family ever built," Nelson said. His voice was steady, or close to it. "And I want you to know that you didn't just save this ranch. You showed me what it looks like when someone is genuinely on your side. I don't know if you know how rare that is. I didn't know until you." She was very still. "And I have spent 7 weeks working with you every day and eating dinner across from you and watching you do things that most people would have found impossible, and I have found myself, more mornings than I can count, looking forward to the part of the day where you're in it." He paused. "Which is not a business arrangement, Mamie. That's something else." The fire in the hearth spoke quietly. The wind moved against the windows. Outside the night was deep and cold, and the stars would be brilliant. Mamie looked at him for a long moment, and she set her book down on the side table with deliberate gentleness, and she said, "Nelson," his name, the first time she had used it. "I came here because I needed somewhere safe," she said. "I told you that on the first night, and I meant it. I was tired and I had been made to feel foolish, and I needed a place where I could just be competent and useful and not have to perform anything else." She paused, and the quality of her expression was changing, opening slightly, the way a carefully held thing opens when it becomes safe to put down. "And then I got here, and you let me help you. Not because you were performing graciousness or because you had no choice, but because you genuinely let me in and you trusted my judgment and you listened to me." And that she stopped. "What?" he said quietly. "That is not a small thing," she said. "In my experience, it is a very large thing." He waited. "I have felt it too," she said, simply, clearly, in the way she did everything. "Whatever this is, I have felt it." The fire and the wind and the room were very quiet for a moment. Nelson stood up and crossed to her chair, and she stood too, because she was Mamie Hadley, and she was not a woman who received things passively. And they were standing very close in the lamplight, and he took her face in both his hands with a tenderness that felt like the other side of everything he had been carrying alone, and he kissed her. She kissed him back with all the warmth she had been keeping carefully managed and precisely organized for 7 weeks, and it was, in every way, the most honest thing either of them had done in years. When they separated, she was looking at him with those green eyes that were completely clear and completely present, and he said, "I should have said it before tonight." "You said it exactly when it was ready to be said," she told him. Outside, the Kansas stars were burning. December moved over the plains with a slow, white patience. The first real snow came on the 8th. Covering the double H in a silence that was not absence but presence, the particular presence of winter in open country, where the sky feels lower and closer, and the world contracts to what is immediately around you, and what is immediately around you becomes more precious for being the thing within the circle. Nelson and Mamie were careful with what was growing between them, careful in the way that people are careful with things that are real rather than performed, that require tending rather than dramatizing. They worked together every day and ate their meals together and talked about the ranch and about books, because she was a voracious reader, and he had books on his shelf that had gone unread for years, and she made him read again, and they argued companionably about a Harper's Magazine account of the railroad expansion, and about whether the new well Henry Carver had mentioned in passing would benefit the South pasture. They also, gradually, told each other things. Real things, the kind that are not useful and not strategic, and are simply the things you tell someone when they have become the person you tell things to. She told him about her mother, who had died when Mamie was 15, and about how she had run the household after that, the younger siblings and the accounts and the farm, and how the discipline of it had become so automatic that she had almost forgotten there was something else she had wanted before all of that, which was just to sit somewhere quiet and read, and not have to solve anything for an afternoon. He told her about Clara. He told it slowly, carefully, because it mattered too much for carelessness, and she listened with the fullness of attention she brought to everything important, and when he was done she said, "She sounds like someone who was worth loving," and he looked at her and said, "She was," and there was no shadow in it, just the clean truth of a grief that had been carried honestly for 3 years and was now, quietly, becoming a memory instead of a wound. He asked her, one December evening, about the man in Newton, about the betrayal that had sent her onto the road with her carpetbag. She told him. His name had been Clement Ford, and he had been charming and educated, and she had thought he was honest because he had the language of honesty, the vocabulary of integrity, and it was only later, after the wife had come to her door and the whole carefully constructed deception had collapsed, that she understood how thoroughly he had used her trust as a material. "I felt like a fool," she said. "Not because of him, but because of myself, because I had prided myself on reading situations clearly, on knowing when something was wrong, and I had been entirely wrong." "You weren't wrong," Nelson said. "He was skilled at deception. That's a failure of his character, not your perception." She looked at him. "He invested in deceiving you," Nelson said. "That's not a gap in your judgment. That's what betrayal is. It requires the trust of someone good in order to work." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous way to see it." "It's a true way," he said. She was quiet a moment more. Then, "You're quite different from what I expected when I walked into that office, Nelson Hale." "What did you expect?" "A proud man in denial about how badly things had gone. Someone who would resent me for knowing more than him." A small pause. "You were a little proud, but you listened. That's the part I didn't expect. My father always said that the smartest thing a person can do is to know which room they need to be in and then stop talking." She almost smiled, and then she did smile fully, the full version that he had been collecting appearances of the way a man collects something rare, and it changed her face in the way that full smiles do, opening it up, showing the warmth that lived behind all that precise competence. "I like your father," she said. "He would have liked you enormously," Nelson said. And the way he said it, the warmth in it, made her look at him and hold his gaze for a long moment that was not the moment for words. January brought Roy Deckert. Nelson had not forgotten about Roy Deckert. Neither had Mamie. Deckert was Horne's agent, and Horne had been paid but had not, they both understood, been satisfied, because Horne was not the kind of man who accepted outcomes he had not chosen. He would find another lever. Deckert appeared at the county record's office in January with a revised assessment of the Double H that valued the property at 60% of its previous assessed value, citing drought damage and reduced herd size. A lower assessed value was not inherently harmful, but a significantly false one, filed by a member of the assessment board, could be used to challenge the property's standing in future financial instruments, and could make a forced sale easier to execute if Horne ever found another angle. Henry Carver flagged it the day it was filed. He brought the document to Nelson, and Nelson and Mamie went over it together, and Mamie said, quietly and precisely, "This is retaliation." They had already requested an independent assessment in October. That assessment, done by a qualified surveyor from Wichita named Obadiah Wells, had valued the Double H at full market value, accounting for the drought impact. It was on file with Henry Carver. They filed a formal challenge to Deckert's assessment the following week, supported by the independent Wells report, and a letter from Henry Carver outlining the procedural irregularity of an assessment board member filing a personal reassessment of a property whose financial affairs he had been associated with through his agent relationship with the creditor. It was not a subtle challenge. It was designed to be seen. The challenge went to the county commissioner's office, and the county commissioner was a practical man named Franklin Osgood, who was not fond of legal complications in his jurisdiction, and who reviewed the material with the expression of a man who has been handed a problem he did not want. He called Deckard in for a meeting. Nelson and Henry were present. Mamie was not present because she was a woman in 1883, and the commissioner's office had not yet reached the point of including women in formal administrative proceedings, which was an injustice that Mamie acknowledged with a particular quietness that was not acceptance, but was the practical calibration of someone who knows which battles are winnable today. Henry Carver, however, had Mamie's full analysis and her precise documentation of every procedural irregularity, and he presented it with the force of a man who knows exactly what he is doing, and Commissioner Osgood invalidated Deckard's assessment and placed a note in Deckard's county file about the irregularity. Deckard was furious. He said so to several people around Caldwell in terms that were not careful. Horne, when he heard about it, said nothing publicly. But within 2 weeks, Deckard resigned from the assessment board, and within a month, Virgil Horne moved his operations from Caldwell to a town in the eastern part of the state. Not because he was forced to, not legally, but because the Double H had proven to be expensive and difficult and there were easier marks elsewhere. He was gone. Really gone, not just paused. Nelson felt it in the specific way that a particular kind of weight lifts when something genuinely, finally ceases to be a threat. He was standing at the window of his office when he knew it, and he looked out at the Double H yard, at the barn and the bunkhouse and the wide sky above the Kansas plain, and he felt something so large and clean that it almost had no name except that it was somewhere between gratitude and joy. He went to find Mamie. She was in the sitting room with her notebook, reviewing the spring purchase list for the ranch, because it was February now and spring was coming, and there were seeds to order and equipment to assess, and the normal forward-pressing work of a ranch that was still standing and intended to keep standing. She looked up when he came in. "Horne has left Caldwell," he said. She looked at him, saw his face, set her notebook down. "Henry confirmed it," she asked. "This morning." She nodded slowly, taking it in. Then she looked at her hands and then back at him, and the emotion on her face was not the triumphant kind but the deep, quiet, relieved kind that comes from having been genuinely afraid for something and finding out it is safe. "Good," she said, quietly, completely. He sat down across from her and he leaned forward and he took both her hands in his and he said, "Mamie, I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not as my bookkeeper, not as my financial manager, as my wife, if you are willing. If that is something you could want." The fire was burning. The February afternoon was pale gold through the windows. The ranch was outside, solid and real and his, and hers too, he wanted her to know, in every way that mattered. She looked at him for a long, full moment. He waited with the patience of a man who has learned in the past several months that the most important things require the willingness to wait and to be genuinely uncertain about the answer. "Nelson Hale," she said. Her voice was steady, which he had come to understand was not the absence of feeling but the presence of so much of it that she had to hold it carefully to keep it from filling the room. "From the first day I sat at your kitchen table and you told me the truth about everything, I have been slowly and completely falling in love with you. And yes," a pause, "yes, I am more than willing." He was smiling before she had finished. The full, genuine, unguarded smile that Pete Calloway had told him on his second day of employment, 22 years ago, looked exactly like his father's, and that Nelson had always considered the best kind of compliment. He leaned forward and kissed her, and she came toward him. And outside, the Kansas February afternoon was cold and clean and permanent. They were married in March. The wedding was held at the Double H in the yard, on a Saturday morning when the winter had just released its hold, and the first green was beginning at the bases of the grass stems. That particular pale, tender green of early Kansas spring that always looks slightly miraculous given what the winter has been. Henry Carver was there, and Pete Calloway in a clean shirt that he had pressed with visible effort, and Ira Schwartz and his wife, and Martin Kimball and his 3 daughters, and Mrs. Alois Rutter had come from Newton for the occasion, which meant a great deal to Mamie and which Mrs. Rutter treated as simply the natural consequence of having written the recommendation in the first place. The minister was Pastor Aldridge from the First Methodist Church on Chestnut Street, a gentle, somewhat distracted man who performed the ceremony with simple dignity and only lost his place in the text once, which he handled by clearing his throat and proceeding calmly, which Nelson later said was a quality he admired in a person generally. Mamie wore a dress the color of cream and sage that she and Mrs. Rutter had made together in the 2 weeks before the wedding, with small pearl buttons at the cuffs that had belonged to her mother, and had traveled in her carpetbag for 8 years as the one luxury she had not been able to leave behind. Her hair was down, which was unusual for her, and it fell past her shoulders in soft waves, and Nelson, watching her walk toward him across the grass, had to take a careful breath. They made their vows in the clear March morning, under the open Kansas sky, with the double H solid and real around them. And Nelson took Mamie's hand and said the words that he meant with his whole body and his whole history, every generation of Hale land and labor, and the years of being alone and the night she had walked through his door. And Mamie said her words back to him with the clarity and the absolute directness that was who she was. And when it was done, and Aldridge pronounced them married, Pete Calloway's smile was so large and unguarded that his wife, if he'd had one, would not have recognized him. The party that followed was warm and simple and went on longer than anyone had planned. Ira Schwartz brought a fiddle player who had a significant repertoire and no concept of stopping, and there was a long table of food that the women had organized with the collaborative efficiency of people who do this well. And the afternoon turned golden and then long-shadowed and eventually full of stars. Nelson and Mamie stood on the porch for a moment in the early evening, just the two of them, holding glasses of cider and looking out at the yard, and the guests and the light of the fire someone had built at the yard's edge where the fiddle player was still playing. "How do you feel?" he asked her. She looked out at everything, and then she looked at him, and she smiled the full smile, the one he now had the permanent right to. "Like I'm home," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the night was full of music and the sound of people who had come together because something good had happened, and they stood there for a long time together watching it. Spring came entirely. The grass came in thick, aided by winter snow that had melted slowly and gone deep into the soil rather than running off, and Nelson assessed the pasture in April and said it was the best growth he had seen in 4 years. They bought 15 new cattle, young stock, with the money from the bank loan whose terms Mamie had renegotiated in March to a lower interest rate and a longer term, and Pete Calloway supervised the new hands they had taken on for the season with the authority of a man who has had his faith restored in the general situation. Mamie continued to manage the double H accounts, but the work had changed its quality. It was not crisis management now. It was the normal, sustaining work of a going concern, the careful forward attention of someone who is not fighting to preserve something but building it. She found she loved this version of the work even more because building is better than fighting, though fighting when you have to is important too. In April she began to suspect, and in May the suspicion became certainty, and she told Nelson on a Tuesday evening in May while they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the last light leave the sky. She said simply, "I think we are going to need to arrange a crib." Nelson went very still. He turned to look at her. She was watching him with those clear green eyes, and a quality of expression that was entirely unlike her normal precision. It was open and warm and slightly uncertain in the way that the most important things are always slightly uncertain. "Mamie," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "October, approximately," she said. "If I'm calculating correctly, which I believe I am." He laughed. The same quality of laughter as that morning on the Caldwell boardwalk, raw from the journey and real at the end of it. And then he put his arms around her and held her, and she held him back, and the May evening was warm, and the first fireflies of the season were beginning their small lights over the grass below the porch. A boy. He was born in October, on the 15th, which was almost exactly 1 year after Mamie had arrived at the Double H with her carpetbag and her folded letter, and her absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly and entirely herself. He was 7 pounds and furious about his arrival in the world, and had Nelson's dark hair and Mamie's green eyes, which combination was exactly as remarkable as it sounds. They named him Thomas Ephraim Hale, for Nelson's father and his grandfather, and Pete Calloway, when he was shown the baby for the first time, stood holding him with an expression of such profound, helpless tenderness that the image of it stayed with Mamie for the rest of her life as one of the clearest pictures of what love looks like when it has nowhere to hide. Pete said, with great effort, "He looks like your father, Hale." Nelson said, "I know." Thomas was a noisy and demanding and absolutely wonderful baby who had strong opinions about sleep schedules that differed significantly from everyone else's, and the winter of 1884 was less serene than the winter of 1883 had been, but it was warmer in all the ways that matter. The Double H flourished. The 1884 cattle season was good, the best in 4 years, and the herd grew steadily, and Nelson hired on 2 more permanent hands and built a second bunkhouse extension, and the ranch felt, for the first time in a long time, like it was growing towards something rather than holding on. Mamie organized a lending library in the sitting room, which was used by the hands on winter evenings, because books should not sit unread, she said, and Nelson said the sitting room belonged to her to do with as she saw fit, and she said it belonged to both of them, and to everyone on the Double H who needed what was in it. Henry Carver came to dinner every few weeks, and he and Mamie talked about legal and financial developments with the comfortable ease of colleagues and friends, and he said, on one of these evenings, that she ought to have been a lawyer, and she said that perhaps eventually something of the kind might be possible, though the mechanisms for it in 1884 were limited, and Henry said he thought the mechanisms were going to have to change whether they intended to or not, and she smiled at him and said she agreed. Mamie wrote to her younger sister in Missouri, whose name was Agnes and who was 24, and had been working as a seamstress in a small town with diminishing satisfaction. She wrote to tell her that the Double H had a room, and that Caldwell was a town of genuine life and possibility, and that she should come if she wanted to. Agnes came in the spring of 1885 and fell in love with the horizon, which was her word for it. The horizon, which in Missouri had always had something in front of it, trees or hills or someone else's intention, and which in Kansas was absolutely open in a way that felt to Agnes like permission. She also, in the second summer, fell into a steady and eventually committed correspondence with Ira Schwartz's nephew, a young man of 26 named Daniel, who had come to Caldwell to work at the livestock yard, and who shared Agnes's view of open horizons and of the particular importance of a good meal and good company at the end of a working day. But that is its own story. The summer of 1885 was long and warm and full. Thomas was a year and a half old and had recently discovered the word no, which he applied with a comprehensiveness that Nelson said indicated either great strength of character or great future difficulty, and possibly both. He followed Pete Calloway around the yard with the focused determination of a small person who has identified a mentor, and Pete, for his part, showed a patience with Thomas that he had never demonstrated with any adult in living memory. Nelson and Mamie rode out to the north pasture one August evening, just the two of them, with the baby left in Agnes's capable care, and the late sun long and golden across the grass. They rode out to the hillside where the wildflowers came in spring, where Clara was buried, and Nelson got down and stood there for a moment, and Mamie got down too and stood beside him. He was quiet for a while. She put her hand through his arm and stood beside him and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. After a while he said, "She would have liked you." "I would have liked her," Mamie said, "from everything you've told me. The Kansas evening was enormous around them, the sky beginning to go rose and amber at the edges, the grass moving in the wind that was always there, that clean and restless wind that is the breath of the plain. "Thank you," Nelson said. "For what?" "For coming through that door," he said, "with your carpetbag and your notebook and your absolute refusal to pretend the situation was anything other than what it was." She looked up at him. The light was on her face and her green eyes were full of it. "You needed someone who wasn't afraid to look," she said. "I needed you specifically," he said. She smiled at him, not the almost smile, the full one, the one that was still the most remarkable thing that happened in his vicinity on any given day. "Then it's fortunate," she said, "that I read newspaper advertisements." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and they stood on the hillside in the August evening with the whole of the Double H below them, and the whole of the Kansas sky above them, and the whole of their life, built from crisis and courage, and the stubborn refusal to quit, spread out before them like the horizon itself. Thomas would have a sister 2 years later, born in the autumn of 1887, small and fierce and as green-eyed as her mother. They named her Clara Margaret, for the two women who had come before and whose names deserved to be carried forward into the life that had been built in their wake. Pete Calloway held her with the same expression he had held Thomas, and said, to no one in particular, "Two of them." Nelson and Mamie, on either side of him, exchanged a look over his head that was the specific look of two people who have a whole shared language that lives in the space between words. And Nelson said, "Two," in a tone that managed to convey everything there was to convey about how entirely, completely, without reservation, he had not quit. He had been standing at a window with 3 red-stamped notices on his desk and the future narrowing like a river drying in the sun, and she had walked in without knocking and had looked at the notices and looked at him and said it's precisely ideal, and had been right in the deepest sense of the word. Not ideal because the situation was good. Ideal because it was the exact moment that required exactly her, and she had been there for it, and they had been there for each other, and the ranch was standing, and the life was real, and the love between them was the kind that is built from truth rather than performance, from honest work and genuine attention and the willingness on both sides to be seen completely. The Double H stood at the edge of the Kansas plain in the late light of a September evening in 1887, solid and permanent and full of life. 400 acres of Hale family earth under a sky that was the color of everything. And Mamie Hadley Hale stood in her kitchen with a child on her hip and a notebook in her other hand, and the smell of supper on the stove and her husband's voice from the yard. And she thought, with the clarity that was her particular gift, that she had never been more exactly where she was supposed to be. And outside, Nelson Hale stood in the yard of everything he had almost lost and looked at the lighted windows of his home and felt what a man feels when he knows with absolute certainty that the most important thing he ever did was not quit. He had had 3 creditors and 1 hope. She had walked in, and she had been every single day since the reason he had not.